gracelifebiblechurch.com. Scroll down under recent sermons, click on the link for November 16, lesson 267, and you can load the notes that we will be following along with here in class. So, a lot to cover today. I want to get right into it, okay? So, again, lesson 267, assessing the printed history of the King James text, the first American printing. Lesson 266 continued, our exploration of the printed history of the King James Bible, focusing on the 1769 Blayney revision and its legacy. Although modern editions from Oxford and Cambridge Bibles are based on Blayney's text, they contain minor non-substantive differences. Professor David Norton, author of A Textual History of the King James Bible, attributes these variations to commercial pressures, limited demand for textual innovation, and poor archival practices. So we looked at that last time, okay? A major focus of lesson 266 was on Thomas Curtis's 1833 critique in The Existing Monopoly, where he accused the university presses of introducing over 11,000 intentional changes to the 1611 authorized version. Curtis argued that these changes compromised doctrinal clarity and theological integrity. He championed a return to the original 1611 text and greater accountability in Bible publishing, even collaborating briefly with Cambridge on a collation project that was later abandoned. Point 3. Curtis's efforts led to increased scrutiny and ultimately greater uniformity between Oxford and Cambridge editions. Oxford responded with a remarkable 1833 reprint of the 1611 edition, which highlighted the impracticality of fully reverting to the original due to its many quirks and inconsistencies. Norton concludes that while Curtis's concerns were partly justified, the precedent for textual revision existed from the beginning, and the Blayney text remains a de facto standard. Curtis's legacy lies in his push for transparency and standardization in the transmission of the King James Bible. So, point 4. Thus far, our study of the printed history of the text has focused on British printings. Our survey would be incomplete without discussing the history of the text in the United States. It is to the American text that we will now turn our attention. In order to accomplish this task, we will consider the following points in this lesson. We're going to talk first about the colonial period, and second, we're going to talk about the first King James Bible printed in America. Okay? And then there's a note there that all the content in this lesson was taken from my book. It's this book right here, The King James Bible in America, an orthographic, historical, and textual investigation. This was originally published by Dispensational Publishing House in 2019. Okay? So, let me say that as I have gone through this material again to prepare this, so it's now 2025. Unfortunately, I found some stuff in here that I need to update because it's wrong. I didn't know it was wrong when I wrote it, but I now know, based upon better information, that there are a few minor things in here, nothing significant or major, but there are a few things, details, that were not correct in what I originally published, and so it is at some point going to have to be updated to reflect better information, okay? But this book, the text of the King James Bible in America, this came about because of some stuff that had happened in my life. I had been to some Bible conferences and been hearing some stuff about the spelling of words in certain American printings of the King James Bible, like thoroughly, throughly, establish, establish, some of these words, okay? So it probably was the summer maybe of 2012. My wife and I, we were coming home from the Bible conference, and we stopped at my wife's grandmother's house, and she had a copy of the Old Family Bible, okay? This is an 1876 publication of a King James Bible to commemorate the 100th centennial or 100th anniversary of the United States, okay? The majority of the stuff in this Bible is front material. Like I was showing the guys here before class started, that the biblical text doesn't even start until right here. So all this stuff here is front material. Concordance, history, pictures, all sorts of stuff is included in this Bible, okay? So the biblical text doesn't even start until right here. This Bible does also include the Apocrypha. It's got a bunch of stuff in it. A lot of interesting graphics, maps, charts. I was showing some of them. I'm not going to take the time to find all of them again. But what happened was, after this Bible conference and I had heard some of these claims being made, I went to my wife's grandmother's house on the way home, and she had the family Bible on the table, which is this one right here that she wanted to show me. Okay? So I started looking at it with interest and trying to just, look at it, some of the different features and stuff. And I found my way to 2 Timothy chapter 2, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17. And it says here, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly, not throughly, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. So I had just gotten home from a conference where they were talking about if your Bible spells it thoroughly here and not throughly, you had a corrupt Bible. Okay? So, I'm looking at this and I'm like, the family Bible had it thoroughly since 1876. So based upon the logic that I had just heard presented at this Bible conference, was this a corrupt Bible? So then I started doing a bunch more looking up. These are my original notes. I have them handwritten on this piece of paper from when I started doing this, like over 10 years ago. So I went to every place that thoroughly appeared in the text to look it up, and every single time it was spelled thoroughly in this Bible from 1876. So then I did all way and all ways. And every time, just about every time, all way, it was always spelled all ways. And so then I did some other things like stablish and establish and some of the other words, and found out that those were also spelled differently. So then so I got up and I'm thinking to myself, okay, if what I just heard is true, then that means that my wife's family, were they reading from a corrupt King James Bible? So then I started to say to myself, well, how extensive is this? So I went home and I pulled out this one. This one is a Massachusetts printing from 1829, and I started going through it, and I found that some of the words in this one were not spelled the same as British printings, as early as 1829. So then I'm like, well, how far back does this go, and how extensive is this? And it was that led me into eventually publishing this book, the King James Bible in America. What makes this book unique, as far as I can tell, is that it is an attempt to try to understand the King James text in America specifically, and not from the British printings. Okay? So, I had a lot to think through at that time. So, let's get into this then. Does everybody have any comments or questions about that before we move on? Now, does everybody understand the point, right? So, if those are misspellings, and if those are corruptions, then is my wife's family Bible corrupt? So that means all of them were reading this Bible. They're reading a King James Bible. It's not a New American Standard. It's not a Revised Standard. It's not anything but a King James Bible, but did it have different spellings? Okay? So, the colonial period. Prior to the American Revolution, the colonies were supplied with Bibles in the English language from their mother country, Great Britain. Colonial publishers are represented as possessing the impression that if they reprinted the work, they would be guilty of an infringement of the exclusive right possessed by certain parties in England, and thereby expose themselves to prosecution. For a full discussion of the Crown copyright, see Lesson 187. There is also an entire chapter in this book, the King James Bible in America, devoted to what I call the copyright myth. Okay? And this is the myth that exists, that the King James Bible was never copyrighted. That is not true. It was copyrighted in a sense in Great Britain, its country of origin. It is only in America, subsequent to the American Revolution, that the text is viewed as being in the public domain. Okay? So again, we talked about that claim earlier on. Margaret T. Hills, so I'm on page 2. Margaret T. Hills, author of the English Bible in America, reports that, quote, a very early obstacle to printing the King James Bible in America was the Crown monopoly restricting the publication of the King James Bible to the King's printers. So, If you're a colonist living under the jurisdiction of the British Crown, they viewed themselves as subject to Crown authority, and so therefore they viewed themselves as not having the license to do what? Print the Bible text, okay? Because they would have been viewed as infringing upon those in the mother country that had the rights to publish the text, okay? Likewise, English Bible historian Paul, I'm not sure on the last name pronunciation here, Guthar, states, quote, "The story of publishing the English Bible in America finds its roots in the American Revolution. Because of the royal copyright," and there is a slight misuse of the term there, but I'm not going to haggle over that right now, "American printers had never seriously concerned themselves with producing their own English Bibles until political events forced the issue." So during the colonial period, when the 13 colonies are still under the jurisdiction of the British Crown, do American publishers view themselves as having the authority, the right to publish the text? No, they don't, okay? So while the Crown's monopoly constituted the greatest political/legal obstacle in terms of printing the KJB in the colonies, there were other practical and/or logistical concerns as well. First, copies from the mother country were abundant, cheap, and of a higher quality than any of the colonial printers had the capacity to produce. So even if they did it, would they have been undersold by the traditional printers whose Bibles were being imported into the colonies? Okay, so there's no financial, fiscal reason to do it, in addition to the legal reason not to do it. Okay, so there is strong historical evidence to suggest that at one point between the 1690s and the 1720s, the price for a common English Bible, which is what they called it, okay, or i.e. a King James Bible, fell to 1 shilling. And that's a quote from O'Callaghan and his footnote on page 5 of his introduction, okay? So there's no way that an American printer is going to be able to undersell a traditional Crown printer. And so not only do you have the legal obstacle of the print patent, but then you also have the logistical concerns that it basically was totally economically unfeasible for any colonial printer to think that they were going to publish the text and sell it and make money. Okay? Any questions so far?
What was the equivalent and what was the reason it was so cheap?
I'd have to look up some sort of a conversion. But it's so cheap because they have access to the best materials. They've done this so many times. It's easy for them to make big print runs in Britain, and for them to typeset the text.
Cheap in England too.
Yeah, they were. I don't know. It depends on the size of the Bible. It depends on a lot of factors. But the bottom line is, no colonial printer would be able to economically outperform a approved Crown printer.
Reasonably. I mean, it sounds like they're dumping them on the colonial people.
You know, I don't know, Bart. It could be that they would sell somewhat inferior printings to the colonies. I don't know. But the bottom line is, no colonial printer was going to be able to outperform any of these traditional presses, Cambridge, Oxford, etc. Okay. So next point. When one factors in the costs associated with typesetting and printing the entire Bible, there is no way any colonial publisher could have competed against such a price. Second, publishers printing books with the length of the Bible for the first time would typically do so in serial form by subscription over a prolonged period of time. However, the difficulty in securing enough subscriptions to justify the cost of typesetting the text, not to mention printing, caused these projects not to come to fruition. So there is some evidence that some people maybe floated the idea, but nothing ever came of these things, okay? And then that brings me to the next point. Allegedly, in 1752, Keene and Green of Boston printed an edition of the English Bible in a small quarto size. This unconfirmed edition is also known as the Mark Basket Bible of 1752, based on the fact that this edition is rumored to have borne the London imprint of the King's printer Mark Basket. Regarding this mythical edition, O'Callaghan states, quote, it was carried through the press as privately as possible and had the London imprint of a copy which had been reprinted vis-a London, printed by Mark Basket, printer to the King's Most Excellent Majesty, in order to prevent prosecution from those in England and Scotland who published the Bible by a patent from the Crown or cum privilegio, as did English universities at Oxford and Cambridge. This particular edition remains shrouded in mystery, as no known copy could be located by O'Callaghan or anyone else since 1860. So it's alleged to have happened. No one looking through archives or anything has been able to locate such a copy. And so most Bible historians view it as sort of just a myth that it ever happened. Okay? Despite its unconfirmed existence, its legend includes information regarding the forging of the insignia of the king's printer, which speaks to the fact that colonial printers did not dare challenge the Crown's patent on Bible printing. Margaret T. Hills, in her 1961 book, The English Bible in America, written 100 years after O'Callaghan, he wrote in 1861, she wrote in 1961, also has a discussion on the, quote, Boston Basket Bible, in which she concludes, similar to O'Callaghan, that there is no historical proof that the Bible ever existed. So the best we have is like rumor and innuendo here, okay? We don't have any evidence that any King James Bible was printed on American shores during the colonial period, okay? Next point. Thus one passes through the entire colonial history of the American colonies without confronting a single English Bible printed in the New World. One does encounter, however, a few non-English Bibles printed in the colonies, such as John Eliot's 1663 Algonquin translation, as well as his 1708 Gospel of John, published at Boston in both Algonquin and English. Moreover, German immigrant Christopher Sauer commenced printing the Bible in German in 1740 and finished the task in 1743. After Sauer died in 1758, his son printed 2,000 copies in 1763 and another 3,000 copies on the eve of the war in 1776. When the war began, much of the later printing was seized and used as cartridge paper or litter for horses. So those did not have a good end, I suppose. Sauer's daughter succeeded, however, in rescuing the sheets of 10 complete copies, which she caused to be bound. The Declaration of Independence and the crucible of war would prove to be prerequisites to seeing the King James Bible printed on American shores. So, we go through the entire history of the colonial period without a single King James Bible being printed in the United States in any sort of documentable or confirmable way. Okay? So there are political, legal reasons for that, and there are also economic reasons for that. Anybody have any questions before we move on to the next point?
If the Basket Bible was never proved to exist, how's the rumors? Where do the rumors come from?
The rumors exist in letters and different correspondence between people talking about it allegedly happening. There's a couple memoirs and a few places that record it. But again, no researcher specifically looking for it has been able to find one. So, does that answer your question?
So could it have been just gossip?
Could have been gossip, you know. It could have been that maybe somebody was trying to do such a thing. What I find interesting about the rumor, assuming it's a rumor, is that they feel the need to forge the insignia of the king's printer. That tells me how strongly they understood the print patent and what they might be legally susceptible to should they have decided to print the text in the open. Okay?
But how would anybody know how to determine if that was a true copyright?
They could have determined it. I think there's a couple ways.
Okay.
Number one, the quality of the printing, the paper it was printed on, because the colonial paper was not as high quality as the British paper. That's just a fact. So there would have been markers that would have given away the fact that this was not done by the king's printer.
Oh.
Just in things like that. The binding, there probably would have been things that would have given it away. And plus they could have then compared it textually against what the king's printer was actually printing, and so there would have been a few different metrics to determine, you know, if it was a forged copy or a bootlegged copy or whatever. Okay? Anything else before we move on? All right. So, the first King James Bible printed in America. With the opening of the War of Independence, the colonies found themselves cut off from the supply of English Bibles from Great Britain. Quote, by 1777, Bibles for sale in America had become scarce. The war with Britain had stopped much of the colony's international trade, and among the items temporarily lost to the American marketplace was the English Bible. So when war breaks out, once war comes, then getting Bibles, being able to find a Bible for sale from a British printer becomes nigh impossible in the colonies. Okay? Next point. Seeing the impending shortage of Bibles, a group of Presbyterian clergymen petitioned the Continental Congress in the summer of 1777 that Bibles be produced on American shores to combat their scarcity and correspondingly high price. That's the other thing. Any Bibles that you could get were exorbitantly expensive because of the war and because of the shortage. Okay? Congress responded by calling for bids from various printers. 5 Philadelphia printers offered estimates that varied greatly in terms of time, typeface, and paper. Okay? So 5 submit a bid. They're varied in terms of how long it will take, the quality of the paper that they're offering, and what kind of typeface they're going to be able to use to print. Okay? The entry from the Journal of the Continental Congress from Thursday, September 11, 1777, records the findings of the Congress with respect to this petition. It reads in part, quote, they have conferred fully with the printers and in this city are of opinion that the proper types for printing the Bible are not to be had in this country and that the paper cannot be produced. But with such difficulties and subjects to such casualties as render any dependence on it altogether improper, that to import types for the purpose of setting up an entire edition of the Bible and to strike off 30,000 copies with paper binding will cost 10,000 pounds, more than 10,000 pounds, which must be advanced by Congress to be reimbursed by the sale of the books. That, in the opinion of the committee, considerable difficulties will attend to the producing the types and paper, that afterwards the requisite of importing them will considerably enhance the cost, and that the calculations are subject to such uncertainty in the present state of affairs that Congress cannot much rely on them. So what are they concluding? Not going to happen. Okay, there's a war. There's all sorts of things going on. There's too much uncertainty. Okay? Next point. We're on page 4, right? Because I'm kind of following the digital notes here at this point. So, after considering the bids, the Congress decided that it would be much cheaper and reliable to simply import Bibles. So they decided to attempt to procure 20,000 Bibles from Holland, Scotland, and elsewhere in Europe. Quote on this. The use, again quoting from the journals of the Congress, that the use of Bibles is so universal and its importance so great that your committee refer the above to the consideration of Congress, and if Congress shall not think it expedient to order the importation of type and paper, your committee recommend that Congress will order the Committee of Commerce to import 20,000 Bibles from Holland, Scotland, or elsewhere into different ports of the states in the Union. Whereupon the Congress was moved to order the Committee of Commerce to import 20,000 copies of the Bible. That's from page 734 of the journals. Okay? So how are they going to rectify the situation? They're going to try to import them. Okay?
So Scotland wasn't part of Great Britain?
I think what they thought is they could more easily smuggle or get their hands on copies out of Edinburgh than they could out of Oxford, Cambridge, or London. That's my reasoning. I'm gathering that because they don't say, but that seems like a reasonable inference given the information that we do know. Okay. Regarding this resolution to import Bibles from elsewhere in Europe, historian Paul Gutjar, all right, reports that, quote, no action was ever taken on this decision. for soon after it was made, the Congress had to flee Philadelphia. This petition for Bibles faded into the background forever as the Congress found itself with the more pressing concerns of war. So in other words, nothing appears to have ever come out of this, because shortly after they make this ruling to import the Bibles, Philadelphia is attacked by the British and the Congress has to flee, and so nothing ever comes out of this resolution, for lack of a better word. Okay? Any questions so far?
Were there any entrepreneurs that were just trying to bring Bibles in?
Well, keep reading, Bart.
Okay. That's usually how it happens.
So, it was Robert Aitken, how do we say this? Aitken. It was Robert Aitken of Scotland, one of the 5 printers who submitted a bid to Congress for an American printing of the English Bible, who braved the uncertainties of war to produce the first English New Testament in the New World. Aitken, who was also Congress's official printer, publishing the Congressional Journal, did not let the decision to import Bibles from Europe stop him from pursuing the enterprise. Given the fact that it required substantially less work and resources to print the New Testament when compared with the entire Bible, Aitken limited his work accordingly. In 1777, he published the first English New Testament ever printed in the colonies. Aitken's risk paid off and was met with great success, so much so that he produced editions of his New Testament in 1778, 1779, 1780, and 1781. Thus began the printing of the King James Bible in what would soon become the United States of America. So Bart, you're right. The entrepreneurial guy decides, I don't need the approval of the Congress. I'm just going to take it upon myself to publish it. And he publishes the New Testament first. Now, all I can say is that makes sense. Is the New Testament considerably shorter than trying to print the whole Bible? Okay? And so he does this, and there are multiple editions that he prints during the war years. Okay? Any questions so far?
It's also easier for soldiers to handle a New Testament instead of the whole Bible.
So yeah, there's a lot of economical reasons why you could conceive of that being a smart decision on his part. Yeah.
It's just one of the most American things to do, really. Dump their tea in the ocean and take the Bible.
Yeah. So, next point. In a petition dated January 21st, 1781, Aitken announced to the Continental Congress that he had undertaken to print an edition of the entire Bible. On Thursday, September 12, 1782, the Congressional Committee assigned oversight on the, quote, Aitken Memorial, and gave the following update on Aitken's progress and product, quote, that Mr. Aitken has at great expense now finished an American edition of the Holy Scriptures in English, that the committee have from time to time attended to his progress in the work, that they also recommend it to the 2 chaplains of Congress to examine and give their opinion of the execution, who have accordingly reported thereon, the recommendation and report being as follows. Philadelphia, 1st of September, 1782. Reverend gentlemen, our knowledge of your piety and public spirit leads us without apology to recommend to your particular attention the edition of the Holy Scriptures publishing by Mr. Aitken. He undertook this expense work at a time when, from the circumstances of the war, an English edition of the Bible could not be imported, nor any opinion formed how long the obstruction might continue. On this account, particularly, he deserves applause and encouragement. We therefore wish you, reverend gentlemen, to examine the execution of the work, and if approved, to give it the sanction of your judgment and the weight of your recommendation. We are with very great respect your most obedient humble servants, signed James Dunn, yes? Duane, Chairman. In behalf of a committee of Congress on Mr. Aitken's memorial, Reverend Dr. White and Reverend Dr. Duffield, chaplains of the United States in Congress assembled, report, gentlemen, agreeably to your desire, we have paid attention to Mr. Robert Aitken's impression of the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament, having selected and examined a variety of passages throughout the work. We are of opinion that it is executed with great accuracy as to the sense and with a few grammatical and typographical errors as could be expected in an undertaking of such magnitude. Being ourselves witnesses of the demand for this invaluable book, we rejoice in the present prospect of a supply, hoping that it will prove as advantageous as is honorable to the gentleman, who has exerted himself to furnish it at the evident risk of private fortune. We are gentlemen with your very respectful and humble servants, signed Mr. William White, George Duffield. Philadelphia, September 10, 1872. Honorable James Dunn, Esquire, Chairman, and the Honorable Gentlemen of the Committee of Congress on Mr. Aitken's memorial. Whereupon resolved, the United States in Congress assembled highly approved the pious and laudable undertaking of Mr. Aitken, a subservient to the interests of religion as well as an instance of progress of arts in this country, and being satisfied from the above report of his care and accuracy in the execution of the work, they recommend this edition of the Bible to the inhabitants of the United States, and hereby authorize him to publish this recommendation in the manner he shall think proper. That's from the Journals of the American Congress from 1774 to 1788, volume 4, pages 75 and 76. Okay, so go to page 6. So you can see from this, is this like a big undertaking here? Okay, so top page 6. Aitken's Bible of 1782 was the first Bible printed in this country in the English language having an American imprint. The report and resolution of the committee quoted above was reproduced inside Aitken's Bible following the title page, but before the table of contents for the Old and New Testament. So here's a screenshot. I have a digital copy of this Bible. Here's a screenshot, the Holy Bible containing Old and New Testaments, newly translated out of the original tongues, and with the former translations diligently compared and revised. And here you can see Philadelphia, imprinted and sold by R. Aitken, and then the Roman numerals would equal 1782. Okay, and then here's the next page. Go to page 7. So when you opened the Aitken Bible, let me just make sure I understand. You would first encounter this title page, and then immediately following the title page would be the resolution of Congress that I just read. Okay, so here's the resolution with all the names and content that I just shared with you. Scrolling on to page 7 now, where you get the end of it, or page 8, excuse me, where you get the end of it. So that was in his Bible after the title page, before the table of contents. Any questions before we move on to the next point?
Could you go back to that title page a minute?
Yeah.
What does it say at the bottom? I just found that interesting at the very bottom.
Here?
Printed and sold by R. Aitken at Pope's Head, 3 doors above the what? Coffee house?
I think so. In Market Street. So that's like an address of where you could find his print shop.
Yeah.
Okay, so you could get your Bible and drink coffee, same as today.
See, definitely American. About it, man. I like this guy.
Across from the Target store.
All right, so any questions before we continue with this? So this is the first complete Bible. So remember, before 1782 had Aitken published multiple editions of the New Testament during the war. Okay? So, next point. Textually. So that's a question. Textually, what is this Bible? Textually, Aitken's Bible does not conform to the standard King James Oxford text of 1769 edited by Blaney. Now this is something I got wrong in the book. I said I didn't know any better. I didn't know 10 years ago that there were different editions of the Blaney text and that other printings didn't match. I just assumed that after 1769 every printing matched Blaney's text. Okay, so this is something I got to correct and fix in the book. Textually, Aitken's Bible does not conform to the standard King James Oxford text of 1769 edited by Blaney. When compared against 8 readings identified in Lesson 265, Aitken's Bible represents a slightly different form of the text than the one published by Oxford in 1769. Currently, Aitken's exact exemplar is unknown. So I don't know, and I have not seen anybody who has written about this be able to identify precisely what Aitken used as an exemplar to create his Bible. But it is very clear from the facts that we're going to look at here shortly that it was not the Blaney text of 1769. Okay? So here's the examples. Okay? Here's Joshua 19:2. The Blaney text, remember, just had Sheba. The Robert Aitken text has what? And Sheba. So it doesn't have the and in front of Sheba. Okay, so that's him not following the Blaney text of 1769. So look at the point underneath that. Aitken's reading and Sheba differs from both the 1611's or Sheba and the 1769's Sheba. Okay? Page 9. 2 Chronicles 33:19. The Oxford text by Blaney had "and all his sins." Aitken had "and all his" what? Sin. All right? We could go to Job 30 verse 6. Blaney had "to dwell in the cliffs," and Aitken had "to dwell in the cliffs" with the TS instead of double FS. Okay? So Aitken had a different spelling. So again, and by the way, just so you know, when you see M11 instead of H, this means that this is Margaret's appendix of the American printings, not Herbert's catalog. So it's a different catalog. This one is only looking at American printings. Okay? Psalm 148 verse 8. Blaney had "and vapors" with an S. Aitken had "and vapor" without the S. Okay? Nahum 30:16. Blaney had "and fleeth away." Aitken had "and flieth away." All right? So this tells you that he's not using what as his exemplar? He's not using Blaney as his exemplar because does he have readings that are not found in Blaney's text? They're found in other iterations of the text.
Probably something out there though that matches.
Yeah, that's the thing. So we don't know for sure what he's using as an exemplar, but we know for sure it wasn't who?
But there's
It wasn't Blaney.
Gotta be something out there that's most.
I'll show you in a second
Okay.
that Lawrence Vance, Dr. Lawrence Vance, believes that he's following some hybrid of both Cambridge and Oxford. Okay? Zechariah 11:2. "Mighty is spoiled" is what Blaney had. Aitken has "mighty are spoiled." Okay? Matthew 26:39. Okay? Blaney had "and he went a little farther." We already talked about this one a couple weeks ago. Aitken had "and he went a little further." So again, the difference between farther and further. John 14 verse 6. Blaney had Jesus saith unto him, "I am the way and the truth and the life." He puts an "and" before the truth. Aitken followed a different text. Well, he actually has the "and." He does have the "and" here. So again, this indicates that in other places he's not following Blaney, but then all of a sudden he does seem to throw in the "and" here in this verse. Okay? So, look at top page 13. Make sure I get to the right spot here. So, Aitken's Bible from 782 is not an identical match to Blaney's 1769 text. As noted above, the exact exemplar used by Aitken to create the inaugural American printing remains unknown at this time. Dr. Lawrence Vance discusses the Aitken Bible in chapter 3 in a subsection titled American Bibles in his recently published book, The Text of the King James Bible. Dr. Vance states the following regarding the textual basis for Aitken's Bible, quote, "His Bible contains a haphazard mixture of Oxford and Cambridge readings." That's his determination. Okay? For example, razor with a Z is used in 5 places. But I typed that something wrong there, Mike. I got to fix that because they're not spelled exactly the same. One of them should have an S.
One's with an S.
One's with an S, one's with a Z. I can't remember which is which. So, the bottom line is he inconsistent in how he spells razor? Now, have we seen examples of people who will say if you don't spell razor this certain way, you have an illegitimate Bible? Okay. Theirs apostrophe S, Joseph 2:10, and yours apostrophe S, 2 Chronicles 20:15, only have an apostrophe one time, while hers has an apostrophe throughout, except in Deuteronomy 21:15, in Joshua 19:19. Not even sure how to say that. Haparim follows the Cambridge spelling, but Shiloh follows the Oxford spelling. So in other words, in that verse, there are 2 proper names, or 2 proper places. One follows the spelling that's in Cambridge, and then it follows Oxford spelling in a different word. So in other words, it's inconsistent in the way it's spelling it based upon the Oxford and Cambridge. Okay? And the Cambridge spelling of names in the names of 1 Chronicles is followed 5 times, while Oxford spelling is followed 6 times. So what is Vance's point here? His point here is that the Aitken Bible seems to be a haphazard mix of both Oxford and what? Cambridge. Okay? And then look at the next sentence. Additionally, established, this is one of our buzzwords, Stablish is spelled establish in 4 places. 2 Samuel 7:13, 2 Chronicles 7:18, Esther 9:21, and 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 13. A hyphen is added to men children in Exodus 34:23, housetops in 2 Kings 19:26, and gray-headed in Psalm 71:18, but removed from Methuselah in 1 Samuel 31:2. And the is printed as thy in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16. Following Aitken's first New Testament in the Cambridge edition of 1620, in the Cambridge 1629 edition. So, according to Vance, the Aitken text represents a mixed text containing both Oxford and Cambridge readings as well as mixed spellings. Therefore, from the very first printing of the text in the United States, so we're talking the inaugural printing of the entire Bible in the United States dated to 1782, okay? Therefore, from the first printing of the text in the United States, differences in orthography, i.e. spelling, were already present, okay? As we will see in future lessons, these differences in spelling between British and American editions would grow as the text continued to be printed in the United States. So razor is spelled 2 different ways, stablish is spelled establish, and this is happening from the very first printing of the text in the United States. Okay? Any questions before we go on?
But if he added all these hyphens, doesn't he mess up our number count?
He would be.
Now our word count's off.
The word count, they don't, so again, do they work in every edition? So look, some of the logic that people advance in the pro-King James space online would mean then that this is an illegitimate edition because some of the words aren't spelled the way they say they should be spelled, because hyphens have been added, throwing off word counts and all sorts of other stuff. Okay? And I'm saying to you that I think this kind of thinking is extreme. Are you telling me that coming out of the War of Independence, that Americans, these pastors that reviewed this for the Congress and said that they were, that it was okay to be using, do you think that these people are all trying to corrupt the Word of God? Or are they trying to do their best to have a text for Americans to use in terrible circumstances and conditions?
Because, I mean, at the time, he was his own typesetter, he did everything, and he doesn't have any competition. So basically, he's saying, hey, this is the best that we've got.
Right.
Because he doesn't have a lot of motivation to like be different than the next guy. You know, he's the only guy in town because the British aren't giving us Bibles anymore.
Yeah, so we'll see some more about that in a minute, but let's...
Is there anything to be said about trying to be slightly more American speaking sounding?
So I think that's a good question, Bart, and I think that eventually, yes, that's intentional. Whether or not he changes the spelling of Stablish to Establish to intentionally be quote-unquote American, it's unknown to me, so I would be surmising.
To me,
but
if we're not, being so technical, it would just sound better to me.
Right.
If I was an American, and I wouldn't see any problem if I was the printer changing that, but maybe that's not the way.
And obviously he seems to be, if you take Vance's research on face value, does Aitken seem to be
Pretty consistent.
I mean, he's trying to be pretty consistent, but are there places where he seems to be taking some orthographic liberties, orthography meaning spelling,
but very minor.
But very minor, right? He's not like dropping whole verses or
Right.
doing anything crazy. He's just some of the stuff is just spelled a little bit different. Okay, look at the bottom of 13. Since Establish is often discussed as an example of corruption in modern printings of the King James Bible, I would like to look at occurrences of that change as a case study. Vance notes that 4 times Establish was used by Aitken instead of Stablish. So look at the next page. So here's the first one. 2 Samuel 7:13. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Okay, everybody grab your Bible. Find 2 Samuel 7. Second Samuel chapter 7. And look at verse 12.
Established.
And when thy days be fulfilled, thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, and I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. What does yours have? He says establish in verse 12, right? Then verse 13. Mine says, and he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. The Hebrew words are exactly the same in verse 12 and verse 13. Okay? Is verse 13 talking about something different than verse 12 is talking about in the context? I know you're being sarcastic, Eli. No. So the American publisher comes along and he says what? Establish instead of what? No, he says establish instead of what? Establish. The British one, my Oxford British text, has establish. The American text had what? Well, in this case, it had what? Establish instead of what? So you're telling me that's a massive doctrinal corruption of the text?
Well, it's got 9 letters.
I'm sorry, guys, but like some of the stuff I just can't buy it. Okay. Now notice verse 12. He says, end of verse 12, I will establish his kingdom. So he's going to establish the kingdom. And he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now come to a parallel passage. Get 2 Chronicles 7. Get 2 Chronicles 7. Verse 18. Then will I establish the throne of his kingdom. Then will I establish the throne of his kingdom. So they have what? Establish. There's one example here, and I might have to look it up in the book because it's escaping me off the top of my head. So give me 1 second. where
Your text has established, not established in 18?
in what?
In 2 Chronicles 7:18?
My Oxford has establish. Aiken had establish.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Established.
Look at verse 12. Look at 2 Chronicles 7, verse 12. Is that the right verse? Gets. Let's try 2 Chronicles 17. Let's try 1 Chronicles 17.
Well, there is established in 17:5.
Yeah, so my point is to say, are these things being used interchangeably? Go to 1 Chronicles 17. Hopefully this is the right one.
Are they using it maybe as a past tense versus present or future?
No, I found what I'm looking for. So get 1 Chronicles 17 in one hand and get 2 Samuel 7 in the other. Okay? So, 2 Samuel 7, look at verse 12. And when thy days be fulfilled, I will sleep with thy fathers, and I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his what? His kingdom. Okay? Then you have, so he's going to establish the kingdom. Then look at verse 13. He's going to establish the what? The throne. Okay? Go to 1 Chronicles 17. Notice verse 12. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish his what? Throne. Okay? Then you got verse 14. Look at verse 14. And I will settle him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be what? Established. So, does the Oxford text in one place say he's going to establish the throne, and in another place say he's going to establish the throne? So what's the difference?
No, there is none.
There is none. There's no.
If you look in the King James scholars purposely used a variety of words that mean the same thing.
Yes.
Just to give it more
Flavor. Gravitas.
richness or whatever.
Right.
You're not supposed to use the same word twice.
Right, no two words start with the same sentence, or no two sentences start with the same word.
And here's Noah Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language. Okay? So here's the entry for establish. Verb transitive, to fix, to settle, in a state of permanence, to make firm. In lieu of this, established is now always what? So what's he telling you? He's telling you that in America, this is the American Dictionary of the English Language. In America, when Americans talk, they don't use establish, they use the word what? Establish. But does it mean the same thing? Okay?
So you're making the transition and emphasizing it by using both.
So Aiken is all, here's my point. Is Aiken, let's look at the next one. Esther 9:21, to establish this, and then 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 13, to the end that he may establish your hearts unblameable, etc. Okay? So 4 times does Aiken already change the spelling of that word in the first American printing. So if you are going to dogmatize upon words having to be spelled correctly in order to have the exact word of God, then these Americans, our American forebears, did not have the correct text when it was printed in America. Sorry guys, but like, that's too much for me to swallow. I can't buy that. Okay? So, look at the next point. If one is going to insist that the word must be spelled Stablish in these 4 verses that have the, quote, pure word of God, they must of logical necessity conclude that the first King James Bible published on American shores was a corruption on account of its spelling differences with British printings. I see no reason to draw such a conclusion. The King James Bible was never printed with uniformity on American shores. I can see no positive or practical reason to adopt rhetoric that logically leads to the falsification of millions of editions of the King James Bible simply because they differ in spelling from British printings. Do they have all the same verses? They're not taking out Mark 16. They're not taking out the woman in adultery. They're not taking these verses out. They're just simply spelling words with American what? Spellings. And this is happening from the beginning. Okay? So I got to get on my racehorse here and move to the end of this. But does anybody have any quick questions about this? So here's my point. The reality and the phenomenon that we are going to be expanding upon next week and the week after, is it a reality from the very first time the text is printed in America? Yes. Objectively so. Okay? So, top page 15.
In that dictionary that you showed, if you went to establish, would it have the identical meaning as establish?
If I went to establish?
Yeah.
It's too much to read right now, but I mean, the other one is telling you basically to go here and look at this. So they're still connected. Okay? All right. So before moving on, it seems prudent to pause and appreciate the magnitude of Aitken's accomplishment given the fact that it was the first complete King James Bible printed in America. Aitken committed himself to setting and proofreading type for nearly 2,000 pages of text. Moreover, he somehow acquired a necessary amount of paper at a time when paper had to be made by hand or imported from Europe. In appearance, Aitken's Bible was bound in both 1 and 2 volume printings in simple calfskin, along with some gold-tooled ornamentation. It is also significant to note that Aitken moved away from the common subscriptions sales strategy to a method that involved other booksellers selling his product. He sold or traded copies of his Bible to other printers and store owners who turned around and sold his volume in their shops. Given the astronomical expense associated with printing 10,000 complete Bibles under those conditions, Aitken sought to offset his product costs by securing a loan from the General Assembly of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and a written endorsement of the Continental Congress found in the preface to his edition and quoted above. So remember we looked at that and read that, right? Despite Aitken's due diligence, his timing proved tragic. Almost immediately after the publication of the work, peace was proclaimed with Great Britain. Imported Bibles began to flow again into American shores with the end of the Revolution. As it turned out, English publishers could undersell the price of Aitken's Bible and surpass it in terms of quality because of the long practice of English publishers and their access to better raw materials. Desiring to avoid complete financial ruin, Aitken petitioned Congress to purchase a portion of his stock to reduce his financial losses. In addition, he approached George Washington with the idea of giving one of his Bibles to every veteran of the American Revolution. In the end, neither idea was accepted. In an act of charity, the Philadelphia Synod of the Presbyterian Church agreed to purchase Aitken's Bibles and distribute them among the poor. Quote, resolved, as for Mr. Aitken from laudable motives and with great expense hath undertaken and executed an elegant impression of the Holy Scriptures, which on account of the importation of Bibles from Europe will be very injurious to his temporal circumstances, the Synod agreed that the committee to purchase Bibles for distribution among the poor purchase Aitken's Bibles and no other, and earnestly recommended it to all to purchase such in preference to any other. Okay? So Robert Aitken remained in the printing trade until his death in 1802, but he never fully recovered financially. And there are 50 extant copies of his complete Bible from 1782 that are known to Bible historians. So that is the first, that's a brief story of the first printing of the text in the United States. Okay, we're right at 10 o'clock, so don't really have time for too many comments or questions. The bottom line here is this: as soon as this starts to happen in America, do the texts start to show differences to British texts? And by the way, do the British texts have differences from each other? So why should this be a big deal? Okay? More on this